Namaste everyone, welcome to the course Yoga on Stress Management. Today in this module we are going to talk about stress physiology. So I am Dr. Mithila from Yasvyasa, deemed to be university. I am an associate professor in biochemistry. So in this module we are going to learn about the consequences of stress, the causative reasons for stress and the biological effects of stress. Coming to the introduction, stress is a part of life and is not inherently bad. All forms of life have evolved mechanisms to cope with the stresses of their lives. In fact, we frequently seek stress and we relish its biological effects as being exciting, even psychologically rewarding. Yet no one denies that stress can have a damaging effect on the individual. It is recognition of these harmful effects of stress that has sensitized us to the importance of stress to an animal's well-being. Our challenge is to differentiate between the little non-threatening stresses of life and those stresses that adversely affect an animal's well-being. We often use the term stress in our daily lives. Stress is not a situation or a condition during an adverse event as it is generally assumed. In fact, it is a way by which the body overcomes a demanding or undesirable situation. Whenever we are in some unfavorable condition, whether it is physical or mental, our body tries to maintain the homeostasis, meaning internal settings, and protect itself from such events by adapting some changes. So stress is a series of events our body follows to cope with such situations. Because the term stress has been so broadly used in biology, no clear definition of stress has emerged. In general, stress can be defined as the biological response elicited when an individual perceives a threat to its homeostasis. The threat itself can be called as the stressor. So when the stress response truly threatens the animal's well-being, the animal experiences something called as distress. So the term distress actually helps us to differentiate between a non-threatening stress response and a biological state where the stress response has a very deleterious effect on the individual's well-being. So this can be called as a bad stress. Before we can address the challenges of how to differentiate biologically between stress and distress and how to diagnose stress, we must first develop a framework for organizing our current understanding of animal stress into a concept. So coming to the model of animal stress, so this model divides the response into three general stages: the recognition of a stressor, the biological defense against the stressor, and the consequences of the stress response. It is this last stage of the stress response that will determine whether an animal is suffering from distress or merely experiencing a brief episode in its life that will have no significant impacts on its well-being. A stress response begins when the central nervous system perceiving a potential threat to homeostasis. Whether or not the stimulus is actually a threat is not important, it is only the perception of a threat which is critical. Once the central nervous system perceives a threat, it develops a biological response or the defense that consists of some combination of four general defense responses. The first being the behavioral response, the second being the autonomic nervous system response, the third being the neuroendocrine response, and the fourth being the immune response. So in case of many stressors, the first and undoubtedly the most biologically economical response is the behavioral one. Obviously, behavioral responses are not appropriate for all stressors, and animals may also find themselves in situations where behavioral options are very limited. An animal's second line of defense during stress is the autonomic nervous system. Here when we say animal, you should also remember that humans are also belonging to the animal kingdom. So whether we call it an animal or a human, we are talking about the stress that is causing the animal kingdom. So this system was the basis of Cannon's proposed flight or fight response during stress. So the autonomic nervous system affects a diverse number of biological systems including cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, exocrine and the adrenal medulla. The results are changes in heart rate, blood pressure and gastrointestinal activity, and many of the physical signs were personally associated with stress. Because the autonomic responses affect very specific biological systems and the effects are of relatively short duration, and the stress activation of the autonomic nervous system does not persist for a very long term. In contrast to the effects of the autonomic nervous system, the hormones secreted from the hypothalamic, pituitary and the neuroendocrine system have a very broad and long lasting effect on the body. Virtually all of the biological functions that are affected by stress, including immune competence, reproduction, metabolism and behavior, are regulated by these pituitary hormones. In the majority of stress studies, the HPA axis, that is the hypothalamic, pituitary and adrenal axis, has been the primary neuroendocrine axis which was monitored. So increases in the circulation of cortisol and corticosterone, the stress hormones, have long been equated with stress. However, the secretion of prolactin and somatotropin, which is the growth hormone, has also proven to be equally sensitive to stress. Likewise, even thyroid stimulating hormone and gonadotropins, which is the FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone, are either directly or indirectly modulated by stress. So neuroendocrine system is one of the keys to our understanding of how stress alters biological function, resulting in distress. We have recently come to appreciate the direct role that the central nervous system plays in regulating the immune system during stress, and also that the immune system in its own right is one of the major defense systems responding to a stressor. Measurements of immune competence offers us a potentially powerful tool for evaluating the disease components of the distress. So all of the biological defenses used to cope with the stressor alter the biological function. The autonomic nervous system may increase the heart rate, and secreted glucocorticoids such as cortisol will alter the glucose metabolism, increase the blood concentration of the glucose. A behavioral response alters the ongoing behavioral patterns. It is these stress-induced changes in the biological functions that will directly affect the animal's welfare. Whether or not the stress-altered functions are beneficial in helping the animal to cope is not important. The changes in the biological function during stress will result in a shift of biological resources away from the activities occurring before the stressor. For example, energy which was originally meant to be utilized for growth or reproduction might be needed or consumed by the animal to cope with the stress. This change in biological function during the stress is termed as the biological cost of stress. It is evident that stress response is a cascade of biological events, the nature of which may vary between animals. So relying on one or even two of these biological defense responses to measure stress is not a reliable approach to evaluating animals' well-being. It is the change in the biological function that is important and not the mechanism that induces the change. So coming to the stress response pathway. So stress response pathway has been very detailedly elucidated. All organisms, including humans, continually encounter internal and external changes in the environment. For example, cold, infection, hemorrhage, electric shock, vibrations, emotional distress, sleep deprivation, social stress, predatory threats, which may trigger a stress response that overturns their internal rhythms and homeostasis. So perception of a stressor, whether it is a conscious one or not, it is communicated to the body via the central nervous system, which acts both neuronally for an immediate reaction and hormonally for a delayed or a prolonged response. So therefore a stress can be considered as a series of events that starts with a stimulus, that is the stressor, and which triggers a reaction, which is the perception of stress, and results in the activation of various physiological systems, that is the stress response itself. So the primary responses involve two major biochemical axes that elicit cellular changes in the adrenal gland when a threat is perceived. One through the fast acting sympathetic nervous system or the SNS, and through the slow acting hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that is the HPA axis. Both of these primary responses are readily activated and their actions are designed to prioritize vital bodily functions that prepare the organism for rapid engagement against the stressor. Following perceived threats, the SNS responses are immediately propelled through efferent sympathetic nerve fibers that result in the circulatory release of catecholamines, that is the epinephrine and the norepinephrine. So the release of catecholamines directly into the tissues and circulation have immediate and potent effects on respiration and cardiovascular systems, blood oxygen transport capacity, blood glucose and free fatty acid levels that are collectively known as the fight or the flight response, meaning either you fight the stress or you run away from the stress. So the HPA axis is the second primary stress response axis and involves the delayed release of glucocorticoids, that is the cortisol or the corticosterone in some mammals, and this is released from the adrenal cortex. So the activation of stress response is dependent on individuals' evaluative coping capacity, whereby physiological responses can be blunted if the capacity to cope with the stressor is effective, meaning how well you have trained your mind to cope with the stress also is triggering or responsible for changing the stress response pathway or regulating the stress response biologically. So coming to the HPA axis, that is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, it is a complex set of direct influences and feedback interactions among three components. So the three components include the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, which is a P-shaped structure located below the thalamus, and also the adrenal glands. It is a small conical organ on top of the kidneys. How does the HPA axis actually work? When something stressful happens, the initial response is mediated by the sympathetic nervous system. So this causes the release of hormones, the norepinephrine and epinephrine, and which triggers certain physical responses to the stress, such as increased heart rate. About 10 seconds after this initial response, the HPA axis will be stimulated. Firstly, the hypothalamus will release a hormone called the corticotropin releasing hormone, or the CRH. CRH is the central regulator of the HPA axis. As well as increasing the activity of the sympathetic nervous system, it also works by signaling the pituitary gland, which is located just below the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary gland releases a hormone into the bloodstream with the adrenal glands as a target organ. So this hormone which targets the adrenal glands is the adrenocorticotropic hormone, or the ACTH. So the ACTH released by the pituitary travels down to the adrenal glands, which is situated above the kidneys. So the adrenal glands are composed of the medulla, which is located in the center of the glands, the cortex, which is the outermost layer of the glands. The medulla is usually activated during the initial stages of stress and releases epinephrine to stimulate the fight or flight response. So the adrenal cortex, which is the target destination of ACTH, produces steroid hormones. So ACTH binds to the receptors of the cortex where hormone called cortisol, which is a type of a glucocorticoid, is synthesized. So glucocorticoids are hormones that can affect metabolism and have anti-inflammatory and immunosuppressive effects. So cortisol, which is commonly called as the stress hormone, actually helps to mobilize the body's energy through the use of glucose, so that body has enough energy to cope with the prolonged stressor. Cortisol increases glucose in the bloodstream. The release of cortisol also causes several other effects to the body to help it deal with the stress that can last longer than a few minutes, like increased in blood pressure. This then results in more blood supplying to the skeletal muscles in the event of stressful situation which requires physical exertion, such as needing to run away or to fight. So cortisol acts during the experience of the serious stresses to also inhibit the activity of processes that are deemed unimportant at the time of stress. For instance, the desire for reproductive activity is inhibited, as this would not be essential for the survival at the time of a serious threat. Cortisol is often released for several hours after encountering a stressor. At certain blood concentration of cortisol in the bloodstream, it is sensed by the receptors in the areas of the brain such as the hypothalamus and the hippocampus. The cortisol exerts what is known as the negative feedback to the hypothalamus, which then releases the CRH, therefore inhibiting the hormonal release. So cortisol also inhibits the anterior pituitary gland, which releases the ACTH, thus inhibiting the hormonal release. This then leads to a shutting off of the stress response, because at this point the homeostasis has been returned. These negative feedback loops are designed to protect the body against prolonged HPA activity. What happens if the HPA axis is stimulated for prolonged times? It can cause HPA axis dysfunction. So what is HPA axis dysfunction? As discussed, this axis is important for regulating the body's response to stress. However, there can be instances where this response is experiencing, such as being overstimulated, which can result in physical or psychiatric problems. So causes of HPA axis dysfunction could result from either genetics, biological causes, for example due to certain medications, early life environment because of some childhood trauma, or current life stressors actually. Some of the general symptoms of the HPA axis dysfunction include feeling irritable, frequent illnesses, difficulty in coping with the stress, feeling unexplainable tiredness, feeling overwhelmed, or experiencing an exaggerated response to stress, what we usually call as an outburst or an overreaction. So individuals with elevated cortisol levels in general may experience a suppressed immune system response, making them more susceptible to infections. High levels of cortisol could also lead to other physical conditions such as diabetes. Why? Because increased cortisol levels usually also leads to increased glucose production, so leading to hyperglycemia and therefore leading to diabetes. It also causes hypertension, then obesity, then menstrual irregularities, muscle weakness, insomnia, cardiovascular disease. So most of our organ systems are affected due to prolonged stress response. So chronic stress from life events can be repeatedly cause the HPA to be overactivated and for longer periods of time, which is very undesirable. So chronic stress such as from work or from any illness or from a grief, this can shift the normal circadian rhythm of the release of cortisol as well as during the stress induced occurrences. So after a chronic stress, the cortisol baseline levels are elevated. This can result in the body's cortisol response to acute stress to be lessened. That means you are triggering more actively compared to others who have a better response to stress. It may also take longer for stress-induced cortisol levels to return to pre-stress levels. So the chronic stress can therefore make the HPA axis more sensitive, resulting in higher cortisol exposure or higher cortisol burden following each stressful episode. When there is excessive exposure, this is when it can influence the development of neuropsychiatric and metabolic disorders. So long-term stress resulting in overactivation of HPA axis can result in the development of mental health condition, overstimulation of the HPA axis, and high cortisol levels have been found to be implicated in mood disorders such as depression, as well as being linked with anxiety, mood swings, and irritability. So how do you keep this HPA axis under control? How do you regulate the HPA axis? So there are many ways in which the HPA axis can be regulated, although these depend on the situation. If elevated cortisol levels have resulted in Cushing's syndrome, there are medications that can be taken to control excessive production of cortisol. So if mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety are the cause of overactive HPA axis, it may be useful to take medications which tackle these. This can include antidepressants, which are essential for the neurotransmitters around the brain to reduce symptoms which could be causing the depressive feelings and the excessive stress. And likewise, counseling sessions can help individuals experiencing excessive stress to recognize which may be triggering their stress and how to control it better. Biofeedback is another method that can be used to reduce stress. This involves being able to see or hear physiological information about the body, such as being connected to a machine that measures heart rate. Through being able to see a high heart rate, for instance, this biofeedback can encourage individuals to attempt to lower their heart rate to a normal level and understand which techniques work to enable this. Finally, there are also some lifestyle changes that can help lower the stress levels, which should be ultimately keeping the HPA axis working regularly. These include a healthy diet with a focus on balancing blood sugar levels, avoiding caffeine, alcohol and other psychostimulants, ensuring a regular sleep pattern and enough sleep, taking part in regular exercise such as aerobic activities, relaxation techniques such as deep breathing exercises or pranayama, then undergoing meditation courses, doing regular yoga and mindfulness practices. All of these non-pharmacological interventions will surely help in reducing the stress response and reduces the effects of the distress. Ultimately, it's not the load that breaks you down, it is the way you carry it. So thank you. Hopefully you understand the physiology of stress, and this will give you enough information to control your stress response. Thank you.